Let's see how we can create our own mergeMap operator for RxJS. Let's take a look at our test first. In our test, I'm creating an observable using a new observable. That observable is going to send the next event 1 after immediately, and then it's going to send the value 2 after 30 milliseconds, and then it's going to complete after 50 milliseconds. Then I'm applying the mergeMap operator from RxJS to that observable. mergeMap takes in a function and it will apply that function to every next event. This function is going to return an observable, but mergeMap is not going to send that observable to the next observer, which in our case is the subscribe block, but it is going to subscribe to that observable that it gets from this function under the hood. So I'm going to refer to this subscription as the inner subscription, and it's going to listen to that observable using the inner subscription, and every next event is going to be sent to the next observer. What is specific about mergeMap, which is one of the flattening operators, and what's specific about this flattening operator is that it is going to do this for every observable. So every next event is mapped using this function to an inner observable, and mergeMap is going to listen to all of the inner observables at the same time. So you can see that we map to an observable here, and this observable, if we draw it out in an ASCII marble diagram, is going to emit 3 values and then complete. So in our case, we are just emitting the value 1, so we're passing the value 1, and this is going to emit 1s for the first mapping, and for the second mapping, it's going to emit the value 2, so these are just going to be 2s. So if we draw this out, what mergeMap does in a complete marble diagram, then you can see that we have a source observable that is emitting values. And these source observables are mapped to inner observables. mergeMap is going to subscribe to both of these inner observables. And we're going to have a result observable, which is the, and this should be a complete. We're going to have a result observable, and this result observable is going to have all of the next events, and it is going to complete whenever the source observable has completed, and whenever all of the inner observables have completed. But we'll come back to that later. So in our subscribe block, we are checking that we get the results that we expect, as you can see them here. So let's see how we can create our own mergeMap operator to do exactly the same thing. So first of all, I'm going to make sure that our mergeMap operator can take in that function that's going to map every value to a new observable. And that function is going to be called the project function. And it's a function that takes in the next event and it maps it to an observable that will emit some values. So whenever we have a next event, we are going to call that project function with our next event. And this is going to return an observable. Whenever we get that observable, we can subscribe to the observable. So we can say subscribe, and we can listen for the next event. And every time we get a next event from an inner observable, we are just going to send that to the next observer. Whenever we get an error event from the inner observable, we are also going to send this to the next observer. And whenever we have a complete event, we need to do something else. And I made a typo here. So let's fix that. Okay, so whenever one of the inner observables completes, we can't really immediately send the complete to the observer. We can only complete if all of the inner observables have completed and if the source observable has completed. So let's create some variables here. I am going to use the active variable to count all of the active inner subscriptions. Remember that mergeMap is going to do this. So it's going to subscribe to the inner observable for every next event. So every time we get a next event, we are going to subscribe. So I'm going to do active ++. And every time one of the inner observables completes, I'm going to do active -. So we can check if active equals null. Then we could say that we want to complete the observer, but we can only do this if also the source observable has completed. So I'm going to create another variable. I'm going to call it let outer sub completed, which is going to start at false. And then whenever this happens, so whenever we get into our complete from our source observable, we can say outer sub completed is true. So now if all of the active ones are completed and the outer subcomplete is true, then we know that we can complete the observer. So we can say observer.complete. Whenever we have a complete event in our source observable, we can also check that if all of the active subscriptions, all of the active inner subscriptions are done, which means that this number will be null, then we can also complete the observer. And whenever we have an error event inside of our source observable, we're just going to send that to the next observer. Okay, now this should already work. So we have our mergeMap operator, and if we use it in our test, we should see that it works. If we remove one of these numbers, we should see that it fails. If we add it again, we see that it works. So important to remember here is that mergeMap will is a flattening operator, which means that we never send an entire observable to the observer. Instead, we subscribe to the inner observable, and then we send all of its next events to the observer. And also important to remember is that we are doing this simultaneously for all of the next events. So we have two next events coming in, and these two next events are mapped to an observable and subscribed to at the same time. That's why you can see that we have 1, 1 from the first observable, but we also get a value 2 from the second observable. And then we get 1 again, the first observable is going to complete, then we have 2, 2, and then our entire observable that we create is completing as well. Now the only thing we still need to do is we have these inner subscriptions here, so we need to clean this up. And to do that, I'm going to create a new subscription object. New subscription. And instead of catching the subscription, I'm going to add every subscription to that. So every subscription object has an add method, which takes in some teardown logic. So we can pass it a subscription object. So we can do it like this. And then we can do the same thing for our inner subscription here. So we can say subscription.add, wrap this and do it like this. One more for the formatting. And then we have cleaned up all of these subscriptions because we return this subscription object here. And that is how you can create your own mergeMap operator for RxJS.